The sound begins before you see anything at all. Drip, D. Drip, die. Drip. Water falling through absolute darkness, each drop echoing through limestone chambers that stretch deeper than any light has ever reached. The rhythm is patient, relentless, the same sound that has measured time in this place for millions of years, long before human feet ever disturbed the silence. This is the Bell Witch Cave in Adams, Tennessee, and if you listen closely between those drops, you might hear something else entirely. Something that has no place in the natural world. For 2 centuries, this cave has accumulated stories the way it accumulates mineral deposit. Layer upon layer of terror, each account adding weight to what came before. But we are not here to collect folklore or chase shadows cast by campfire tales. We are here because 6 people, ordinary people with jobs and families and reputations to protect, descended into this darkness and came back changed. 6 credible witnesses who had no reason to lie, no desire for attention, no history of seeing things that were not there. They went down as skeptics and emerged as believers, carrying with them experiences that defy comfortable explanation. What lurks in the Bell Witch Cave? That is the question that pulls us forward, down into chambers where the air grows thick and the walls press close. The encounters began small, almost dismissible. Then they escalated. What started as unexplained sounds became physical sensation. What began as glimpses in the beam of a flashlight became something far more direct, far more personal. We will not reveal these details yet, because you need to descend with us first. You needed to feel the weight of 200 years of history pressing down through tons of limestone and earth. You need to understand that when darkness becomes total, when you are deep enough that no surface sound can reach you, the mind begins to play tricks. Or perhaps, in that profound absence of light, something else begins to play. In the autumn of 1817, in the backwoods of Robertson County, Tennessee, something began that would become one of America's most thoroughly documented cases of supernatural terror. The farmland belonging to John Bell, a prosperous farmer who had moved his family from North Carolina years earlier, sat along the Red River near a settlement that would eventually bear his family's cursed name. The Bell property stretched across more than 300 acres of fertile bottomland and dense forest, and somewhere within that wilderness stood a cave, a natural formation carved from limestone over countless centuries, waiting in darkness for the events that would transform it into something far more sinister than mere geology. John Bell was by all accounts a respected member of his community. He served as an elder in the Red River Baptist Church, a position that carried considerable moral authority in frontier Tennessee. His family included his wife, Lucy, and their 9 children, among them a daughter named Betsy, who was approaching her 12th birthday that fateful year. The Bells lived comfortably by frontier standards, their prosperity built on good land and hard work. But prosperity in the wilderness often breeds resentment, and the seeds of John Bell's destruction had been planted years before the haunting began, in a business transaction that would damn his entire household. The woman at the center of this curse was Kate Batts, a neighbor whose reputation in Robertson County preceded her like a storm cloud. Those who knew Kate described her as sharp-tongued and vindictive, a woman not easily crossed, and even less easily appeased once her anger was roused. She had married Frederick Batts, but it was Kate who seemed to hold the reins of power in that household, managing their affairs with an iron will that both impressed and unsettled her neighbors. Some whispered that she possessed knowledge of the old ways, the folk magic and hexes that had crossed the Atlantic with settlers from the British Isles and Germany, finding new soil in the American wilderness. The dispute between John Bell and Kate Batts centered on a matter that has driven countless feuds throughout human history: the ownership of land and the terms of its sale. Bell had purchased property from Kate and her husband, but disagreement arose over the terms of payment, specifically regarding the interest rates applied to the transaction. According to historical records and family accounts, Kate believed that John Bell had deliberately cheated her, charging excessive interest that violated both community standards and her sense of justice. Whether Bell's actions constituted actual fraud or simply sharp dealing remains unclear across the centuries, but what matters is what Kate Batts believed and what she swore she would do about it. Local legend holds that Kate confronted John Bell directly, her accusations ringing out in a voice that those present never forgot. When Bell defended his position, and refused to make restitution for what Kate considered theft. She allegedly pronounced a curse upon him and his household. The exact words of this curse have been lost to time, filtered through generations of retelling, but the intent was crystal clear. Kate Batts swore that John Bell and his family would suffer for his greed and dishonesty. She promised that he would never know peace again, that something would come for him and his kin, and that his death would serve as proof of powers beyond the mortal realm. At first, the strange occurrences at the Bell farm seemed almost mundane in their oddity. John Bell reported seeing unusual animals on his property, creatures that seemed wrong somehow, not quite matching any species he knew from decades of farming. A dog with a rabbit's head, a bird too large to be natural, with eyes that watched him with unsettling intelligence. When he shot at these apparitions, they simply vanished, leaving no trace of blood or body. His slaves, working the fields, reported similar sightings, their superstitions inflamed by creatures that violated the natural order. Then the sounds began. The Bell family home, a sturdy farmhouse that had stood solid against Tennessee weather and time, became filled with noises that had no earthly source. Scratching came from within the walls, as though rats or squirrels had infested the space between the logs, but no amount of searching revealed any animal presence. The scratching gave way to knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, pounding that seemed to move through the house with intentional malice. The family would hear chains dragging across floors in rooms they knew to be empty. Footsteps walked the hallways when all family members were accounted for, and motionless in their beds. John Bell initially tried to keep these disturbances private, fearing ridicule or worse. In frontier Tennessee, where religious faith ran deep and superstition deeper still, the wrong kind of attention could destroy a family's reputation and standing. But the phenomena escalated beyond any possibility of concealment. The invisible presence that had begun with scratching and knocking soon found its voice, and when it spoke with the accent and inflections of Kate Batts herself. The entity, which the family and eventually the entire region would come to know as the Bell Witch, possessed capabilities that defied all natural law. It could be in multiple places, simultaneously, tormenting different family members in different rooms. It knew secrets that no living person beyond the family could know, revealing private conversations and hidden shames. Most terrifying of all, it could inflict physical harm with devastating effectiveness. Betsy Bell became the primary target of the witch's cruelty, though the reasons remain obscured by time and conflicting accounts. Some versions of the story suggest that the witch opposed Betsy's relationship with a young man named Joshua Gardner, tormenting the girl to force her to break off the courtship. The violence inflicted upon Betsy was witnessed by dozens of people as word of the hauntings spread and curious neighbors came to investigate. The witch would slap Betsy's face so hard that handprints appeared on her skin in full view of witnesses. It pulled her hair with such force that she screamed in agony, her head yanked back by invisible hands. Pins and needles materialized from nowhere to prick her skin. The entity seemed to take particular pleasure in Betsy's suffering, laughing in that voice so much like Kate Batts, as the young girl wept and begged for mercy that never came. But the Bell Witch reserved its ultimate vengeance for John Bell himself. The farmer's health began to deteriorate in ways that physicians of the era could not explain or treat. His tongue would swell in his mouth, making speech impossible. Strange seizures would grip him, his body convulsing while the witch's voice cackled throughout the house. He aged rapidly, vitality draining from him as though something was feeding upon his very life force. The witch spoke openly of its intention to kill John Bell, and it made good on that promise in December of 1820. Bell took to his bed, weakened beyond recovery, and there he lingered while his family kept vigil and the witch's voice mocked his suffering. After his death, a small vial was found near his body, containing a dark liquid that no one could identify. When a drop was given to a cat as a test, the animal died in convulsions almost immediately. The witch's voice filled the house with triumphant laughter, claiming credit for the poisoning, boasting that it had finally executed the justice that Kate Batts had sworn would come. At John Bell's funeral, while his family and neighbors mourned, witnesses reported that the witch sang loudly and joyfully, its voice carrying across the graveyard in a grotesque celebration of successful murder. The entity had achieved its purpose. The man who had wronged Kate Batts was dead, killed by supernatural means that no law could prosecute, and no medicine could prevent. Throughout these years of torment, one location on the Bell property seemed to hold special significance for the entity. The cave that sat on their land, hidden among the trees and limestone outcroppings, became associated with the witch's presence. Family members and visitors reported that the phenomena seemed stronger near the cave, that the witch's voice echoed from its depths with particular resonance. Some claimed to see strange lights emanating from the cave entrance at night, flickering in colors that natural fire did not produce. The cave itself stretched deep into the earth, its passages winding through rock in patterns that disoriented even experienced explorers. Underground streams flowed through chambers decorated with formations that took millennia to create. The darkness within was absolute, a blackness that seemed to swallow light and sound. It was exactly the kind of place that human imagination populates with monsters and spirits, a threshold between the world of sunlight and reason and something far older and less comprehensible. After John Bell's death, the witch's activities gradually diminished, though it promised to return. In 1821, it announced its departure, claiming it would come back in 7 years. True to its word, phenomena resumed briefly in 1828, though less violently than before, and then ceased again. But the cave remained, and the stories that had grown around it ensured that the Bell Farm would never be just ordinary land again. The historical record of these events is remarkably extensive for a frontier haunting. Multiple witnesses provided testimony. John Bell Jr. compiled a family account of the phenomena. Even Andrew Jackson, who would become president, allegedly visited the Bell Farm to investigate the witch, though his presence there is debated by historians. What remains indisputable is that something happened in Robertson County between 1817 and 1821, something that terrified an entire community and left a legacy that would endure for centuries. The Bell Witch Cave stands today as a monument to that terror, a place where the past refuses to remain buried, and the veil between natural and supernatural seems dangerously thin. Margaret Hayes had never been particularly interested in the supernatural. She was a practical woman, a school teacher from Cincinnati who believed in lesson plans and graded assignments and the kind of orderly reality that came from raising 3 children in a split-level house in the suburbs. When she loaded her family into their station wagon in the summer of 1977 for a 2-week tour of the Midwest's natural wonders, she packed sensible shoes, a cooler full of sandwiches, and her trusty Kodak camera. The camera was relatively new, a birthday gift from her husband Tom, and she'd been eager to use it to document their vacation. Caves, she'd read in the travel brochure, photographed beautifully if you had a decent flash. The Hayes family arrived at the cave on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. Margaret would remember the date later with uncomfortable precision, July 27, 1977. The parking lot was half full, which the guide told them was typical for a weekday. Weekends brought the real crowds, the kind where you had to wait in line for the next available tour. But that Wednesday, their group numbered only 14 people. The Hayes family of 5, an elderly couple from Iowa, a young man traveling alone who said he was a geology student, and a family of 4 from somewhere in Indiana. Small enough that everyone could hear the guide clearly, large enough that Margaret didn't feel claustrophobic as they descended into the earth. The cave itself was everything the brochure had promised. The tour guide, a college-aged young man named Kevin, led them through chambers with names like the Cathedral Room and the Crystal Gallery. Formations that had taken thousands of years to form hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Margaret shot an entire roll of film in the first 20 minutes, capturing her children posed beside massive stalagmites, her husband ducking his head beneath a low-hanging section of rock, the elderly couple from Iowa holding hands as they marveled at a pool of water, so still it looked glass. She was particularly drawn to a section about halfway through the tour that Kevin called the Widow's Walk. It was a narrow passage with smooth walls that opened suddenly into a wider chamber. The rock here had an unusual quality, he explained, a high mineral content that made it shimmer slightly in the lamplight. Some visitors claimed it looked almost pearlescent, like the inside of a shell. Margaret had raised her camera and snapped 3 photographs in quick succession, trying to capture that ethereal quality. In the viewfinder, she'd seen exactly what she expected to see: empty cave, beautiful rock formations, and the play of shadow and light that made underground spaces so mysteriously appealing. Nothing unusual happened during the tour. Her youngest daughter complained about being cold. Her teenage son made jokes about bats. Her middle child, always the curious one, peppered Kevin with questions about how the caves formed, whether anyone had ever gotten lost down here, whether there were any ghost stories. Kevin had laughed at that last question, said something vague about local legends, then moved the group along to see the formations in the next chamber. They emerged into sunlight an hour and 15 minutes after they descended, blinking and slightly disoriented the way people always are when they return from underground. Margaret's legs were tired from the walking, and she was already thinking about the next stop on their itinerary. The film sat in her camera for another week. They visited a historic battlefield, drove through the Ozarks, stopped at a roadside attraction that promised the world's largest ball of twine. Margaret took pictures of everything, methodically documenting their vacation the way she documented everything in her life. When they returned home to Cincinnati on August 7th, she had 4 rolls of film to develop. She dropped them off at the pharmacy on a Monday morning, paid for double prints because she wanted to send copies to her mother, and picked them up 3 days later. She didn't look at the photographs immediately. It was a school night, and there were dinner preparations to manage, homework to supervise, the usual chaos of getting 3 children bathed and into bed. It wasn't until Thursday evening, after the dishes were done and Tom was watching television in the living room, that Margaret finally sat down at the kitchen table with her envelope of prints. She'd made herself a cup of tea and was planning to sort the photos into chronological order, maybe start selecting which ones would go into the vacation album she kept on the bookshelf. The cave photographs were in the middle of the stack. She smiled at the one of Tom ducking under the low rock, made a mental note that the one of the cathedral room had come out too dark. Then she reached the 3 prints from the Widow's Walk, the narrow passage that opened into that shimmering chamber. The first photograph showed the passageway itself, empty and atmospheric. The second captured the moment of transition, where the walls widened into the larger space. And the third, the one that made Margaret's hand freeze halfway to her mouth, showed something that hadn't been there. In the background of the photograph, in a section of the cave that had been completely empty when she'd pressed the shutter, stood a woman. Margaret's first thought was that someone from their group had wandered into the frame. But even as the thought formed, she knew it was wrong. The figure was standing at least 20 feet behind where her family had been posed, back in a recessed area that Kevin had specifically told them was off limits. More than that, the woman in the photograph didn't look quite right. There was a translucent quality to her, as if she'd been caught in motion, lured by a slow shutter speed. Except Margaret knew the shutter speed had been fine. She'd used a flash. Everything else in the photograph was crisp and clear. She held the print closer to the lamp, studying it with the same focused attention she applied to grading her students' essays. The figure was definitely female. She could make out what appeared to be a long dress or gown, something pale that seemed to blend into the cave walls behind her. The woman's face was indistinct, features obscured by that same translucent quality that made her entire form look somehow insubstantial. But her posture was clear enough. She was standing very still, her arms at her sides, facing toward the camera, facing toward Margaret. For several minutes, Margaret tried to rationalize what she was seeing. It was a double exposure, she told herself. She'd accidentally taken a photograph on top of another photograph, creating this ghostly overlay. But that didn't explain why the rest of the image was perfectly normal, why only this one figure appeared translucent while everything else was sharp and clear. A trick of the light then, some combination of shadow and mineral reflection that had created the illusion of a human form. She examined the photograph again, trying to see it as random patterns, but the shape refused to resolve into anything but a woman in a long dress. She pulled out the other 2 photographs from the Widow's Walk. In the first one, the narrow passageway, there was nothing unusual. In the second, the transitional shot, she could see something now that she'd looked carefully. A faint smudge of white in the background, so subtle she'd almost missed it. And in the third photograph, the figure was fully visible, unmistakable, impossible to explain away. Tom found her at the kitchen table 2 hours later, the 3 photographs laid out in a row, her tea long gone cold. She showed him what she'd found, watching his face cycle through the same emotions she'd experienced. Curiosity, confusion, skepticism, and then a kind of unsettled uncertainty. He suggested the explanations she'd already considered and discarded. He held the prints up to the light, examined them from different angles, finally set them down with a frown. Over the next several weeks, Margaret became quietly obsessed with the photographs. She took them to a camera shop, where a technician examined them and confirmed they showed no obvious signs of tampering or double exposure. She called the cave, speaking to someone in the administrative office, carefully avoiding mention of ghosts or supernatural phenomena. She asked about the history of the Widow's Walk, whether it had a particular story attached to that name. The woman on the phone was pleasant but not particularly helpful. It was just a name, she said. A lot of the cave sections had names. She didn't know the specific origin. Margaret went to the library. She found old newspaper archives on microfilm, searching for any mention of deaths or disappearances associated with the cave. She found a few articles about accidents, a tour guide who'd been injured in the 1950s, a child who'd gotten separated from her family in the 1930s, but was found safe after 2 hours of searching. Nothing that explained a woman in a long pale dress, standing in a section of cave where no one should have been. The rational part of Margaret's mind kept insisting there had to be an explanation. A flaw in the film, some chemical reaction during development, an optical illusion she was misinterpreting. But late at night, lying awake while Tom slept beside her, she would think about that moment in the cave. She would remember raising her camera, looking through the viewfinder, seeing nothing but empty rock. She would remember the flash going off, the brief moment of illumination. And she would think about what the camera had captured that her naked eye had missed. The terror came gradually, not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small realizations. The figure had been there, whether Margaret could see her or not. She'd been standing in that cave, in that off-limits section, while Margaret and her family walked past. While Kevin the tour guide led them through, talking about mineral deposits and formation rates. While her children laughed and complained about the cold. Something had been there, watching them, close enough that a camera flash could capture her image. Margaret eventually put the photographs away in a drawer, unable to look at them but unwilling to destroy them. They represented evidence of something she didn't want to believe, but couldn't rationally deny. Physical proof that the world contained mysteries that couldn't be explained by double exposures or tricks of light. She never went back to the cave. When people asked about her vacation, she showed them pictures of the Ozarks, the historic battlefield, her children's smiling faces in front of various roadside attractions. She never mentioned the photograph from the Widow's Walk, the translucent woman in the long pale dress, the evidence that something impossible was possible after all. Some discoveries, she decided, were too unsettling to share. Some things were better left in drawers, in darkness, carefully not thought about during the bright and ordered hours of daylight. Jennifer Morrison had worked as a tour guide at Carlsbad Caverns for 3 years, and in all that time, she had never felt afraid underground. She knew every formation, every chamber, every twist in the path through those ancient limestone halls. She could recite the geological history in her sleep, explain the chemistry of stalactite formation to school groups while barely paying attention, and navigate the main tour route in complete darkness if need. The cave was her workplace, nothing more. No different than an office or a factory floor, just with better acoustics and a constant 56 degrees Fahrenheit temperature year-round. On the evening of October 19, 1989, Jennifer was following her usual closing routine. The last tour group, a small party of 8 tourists from Dallas, had departed around 7:30 that evening. It had been a Thursday, she would later recall, one of the quieter nights as autumn settled into the New Mexico desert above. She had walked them back through the natural entrance, answered the typical questions about bats and how deep the caves went, and watched them pile into their rental car in the parking lot before turning back toward the cave entrance with her clipboard and flashlight. The closing checklist was simple but important. Check that all safety rails were secure. Make sure no trash had been left along the pathways. Verify that the emergency lights were functioning. Lock the equipment closet near the big room. Set the climate monitoring stations to night mode. Then make one final sweep of the main tour route before heading back up to ground level, locking the access gate behind her. She had done this routine hundreds of times. Sometimes she did it alone, sometimes with another guide. That particular Thursday, she was by herself, which suited her fine. Jennifer had always enjoyed the quiet of the caves after hours, when the crowds were gone and she could hear the sound of water dripping in chambers far away, counting out geological time, one drop at a time. She started in the big room, that massive underground chamber that never failed to impress visitors, even after they had seen photographs. The pathway lights were dimmed to their overnight setting, just bright enough for her to navigate safely without disturbing the carefully controlled environment the Park Service maintained. Her footsteps echoed against stone that had been forming for millions of years, long before humans walked upright, long before mammals inherited the earth from the dinosaurs. Jennifer found that perspective comforting usually. It made her own problems feel smaller, more manageable. She was checking the railing near the formation they called the Rock of Ages when she heard it. Her name, just her first name at first, spoken clearly but quietly, as if someone were standing about 20 feet away and speaking in a normal, conversational tone. Jennifer, Dart Sal. The voice was female. She was certain of that, with a quality she would later struggle to describe. Not young, not old. Not warm, not cold. Just present. Jennifer stopped walking and listened. The cave was silent, except for the eternal dripping of water somewhere in the darkness beyond the marked path. She waited for 10 seconds, maybe 15, then shook her head and laughed at herself quietly. Acoustics in caves could be strange, unpredictable. Sound traveled in unexpected ways through limestone chambers connected by narrow passages. She had probably heard someone talking in the parking lot above, their voice funneling down through some crack or fissure in the rock, distorted by its journey until it sounded like it was coming from inside the big room itself. It had almost sounded like her name, that was all. The mind filling in patterns where none existed, the same psychological trick that made people see faces in clouds or hear words in random noise. She continued her inspection, moving toward the Temple of the Sun formation. The temperature felt normal, that constant coolness that made her grateful for the sweater she always wore on closing shifts. But something had changed, though she could not immediately identify what. A subtle difference in the quality of the silence, perhaps. Or the way her footsteps sounded as they bounced off the cave walls. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that she was letting her imagination run wild like the tourists who constantly asked if the caves were haunted. Then she heard it again. Jennifer Morrison. Her full name this time, both words spoken with careful precision. And it was closer. Much closer. Maybe 10 feet away, somewhere to her left, back in the direction she had just come from, where there was nothing but empty pathway and ancient stone formations. The flashlight in Jennifer's hand suddenly felt inadequate, its beam too weak against the vast darkness pressing in from all sides. She swung it toward the sound, illuminating pillars of flowstone and the delicate draperies hanging from the ceiling. But nothing else. No person. No source for the voice. She opened her mouth to call out, to demand who was there, but found herself unable to make a sound. Her throat had gone tight with an emotion she had not felt in these caves before. Fear. That was when she noticed the temperature change. The air around her had gone noticeably colder, cold enough that she could see her breath misting in front of her face when she exhaled. In 3 years of working in these caves, Jennifer had never seen her breath. The temperature was constant, always, maintained by the thermal mass of the surrounding rock, and carefully monitored by the Park Service. It did not change. It could not change, not without massive environmental shifts that would take days or weeks to occur. Yet there it was, proof of impossible cold hanging in the beam of her flashlight. She took a step backward, then another, her rational mind struggling to provide explanations, while a more primitive part of her brain screamed at her to run. Thermal inversion, she thought desperately. Cold air sinking from somewhere. But she knew that made no sense. Not like this, not this suddenly. Jennifer Morrison. The voice came a third time, and now it was right behind her, close enough that she should have felt breath on her neck, should have been able to turn and see who was speaking. She spun around, the flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness, and saw nothing. The pathway was empty. She was alone in the big room, exactly as she should have been, exactly as she had been on hundreds of other closing shifts. But she did not feel alone. The sensation of being watched was so intense it was almost physical, like pressure against her skin. She had the distinct impression that something was studying her, examining her with an attention that felt both curious and deeply wrong. The darkness beyond her flashlight beam seemed to have gained weight and substance. It was not just the absence of light anymore. It was presence, awareness, intention. She started walking toward the exit, trying not to run, trying to maintain some semblance of professional calm, even though her hands were shaking badly enough that the flashlight beam wobbled and danced. Behind her, she heard footsteps. Not her echoes, which had a familiar sound pattern she knew well. These were different. They matched her pace exactly but fell slightly out of sync, as if someone were following her, stepping where she stepped just a fraction of a second after she moved. Jennifer abandoned her attempt at dignity and ran. She ran through the big room, past formations she could name in her sleep, her flashlight beam bouncing crazily off walls and ceiling. The footsteps behind her kept pace, neither gaining nor falling behind, a perfect shadow in sound. She did not hear her name again, but she felt the presence following her, filling the passage behind her like cold water rising in a sinking ship. She reached the pathway that led toward the natural entrance and took the turns at dangerous speed, not caring about safety regulations or proper procedure anymore. All that mattered was getting out, reaching the surface, escaping the thing that had somehow learned her name and spoken it in the voice of no one she had ever known. The climb out felt endless, her legs burning with effort, her breath coming in gasps that echoed mockingly in a confined space of the entrance tunnel. When she finally emerged into the cool October night, Jennifer did not stop running until she reached her car. She fumbled with her keys, dropped them, snatched them from the gravel, and got herself locked inside before finally allowing herself to look back at the cave entrance. It was dark and still, just a black opening in the hillside, exactly as it always appeared after closing. Nothing emerged. Nothing followed her into the parking lot. The only sound was the wind moving through the desert scrub and her own ragged breathing. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before her hands stopped shaking enough to start the engine. She drove home in a daze, her mind trying to process what had happened, to fit it into her understanding of the world. By the time she reached her apartment, she had almost convinced herself that she had experienced some kind of breakdown, a stress reaction, or perhaps a minor medical event. Low blood sugar, maybe. Exhaustion. Something rational. Something explainable. But she could not explain the cold. She could not explain hearing her full name, spoken by a voice that came from empty air. She could not explain the absolute certainty she had felt that something impossible had been aware of her, had known her, had called to her from the limestone depths where no living thing should have knowledge of names or language. Jennifer Morrison did not return to Carlsbad Caverns the next day. She called her supervisor from a payphone outside a convenience store, her voice flat and mechanical as she explained that she was resigning effective immediately. She offered no explanation beyond personal reasons. When pressed, she simply repeated that she would not be coming back and hung up the phone. Her supervisor, a man named Robert Chen, who had worked with Jennifer for 2 years, would later tell investigators that he had never heard her sound like that before. Disconnected, he said, like she was reading from a script, like someone had reached inside her and turned off whatever made her Jennifer. He tried calling her apartment several times over the following week, but she never answered. Eventually, he gave up. Jennifer left New Mexico entirely within a month, moving back to her hometown in Oregon without forwarding information or goodbyes to colleagues who had considered themselves her friends. The few people who tracked her down said she would not discuss why she left, would not talk about the caves at all. She had taken a job at a library, they reported, something quiet and safe and completely above ground. When one persistent friend finally asked her directly what had happened that last night at Carlsbad, Jennifer had looked at her with eyes that seemed much older than they should have been, and said only this: "Something down there knows names. It knows who we are. And I don't ever want it to call mine again. I know." The autumn night of October 14, 2003, brought an unusual chill to the Bell Witch Cave, even by the standards of a place that had remained at a constant 57 degrees for thousands of years. David Chen stood at the entrance, watching his breath materialize in the beam of his flashlight, and wondered if the cold he felt had anything to do with temperature at all. Behind him, 3 other members of his paranormal research team were unloading equipment from their van, their movements efficient and practiced after years of investigating supposedly haunted locations across the American South. David had built his reputation on skepticism. In his 15 years as a paranormal researcher, he had investigated over 300 sites, and in every single case, He had found rational explanations for the phenomena people reported. Electromagnetic fields from faulty wiring caused the sensation of being watched. Infrasound from underground water or HVAC systems triggered feelings of dread. House settling, animals in walls, sleep paralysis, carbon monoxide poisoning. The list of mundane explanations was long, and David had documented each one meticulously. He came to Bell Witch Cave expecting to add another entry to that list. The cave owner had agreed to seal the entrance after the team entered. This was David's standard protocol for locations that attracted trespassers or curious visitors. The seal would be documented with timestamp cameras at the entrance, ensuring that no one could enter or exit without detection. If anything unusual happened inside, it couldn't be attributed to pranksters or confused tourists wandering in from other sections. The team would be alone in the cave system for 12 uninterrupted hours, from 8 in the evening until 8 the next morning. Sarah Mitchell, David's audio specialist, had positioned 7 recording devices throughout the cave system before they sealed the entrance. Each device was equipped with omnidirectional microphones capable of capturing frequencies both below and above normal human hearing range. She had also set up a central monitoring station in the main chamber, where they could listen to live feeds from all 7 microphones simultaneously. The equipment represented thousands of dollars of investment and years of technical refinement. If there were sounds to be captured, this system would capture them. Marcus Webb, their environmental monitoring specialist, had placed sensors throughout the cave to track temperature fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, air pressure changes, and even subtle vibrations in the rock. His role was to identify natural phenomena that might correlate with unusual experiences. A sudden temperature drop, paired with a strange sound, for instance, might indicate an underground water source or air current that hadn't been previously documented. Marcus believed that 99% of paranormal experiences had environmental explanations, and his equipment was designed to find them. The 4th member of their team, Jennifer Park, served as their historical researcher and interviewer. She had spent 2 weeks before the investigation compiling accounts of experiences in the cave, dating back to the 1800s. She had documented patterns in the reports, the types of sounds people claimed to hear, the locations where phenomena most frequently occurred, even the times of night when activity seemed most intense. If the team experienced anything unusual, Jennifer would cross-reference it with historical accounts to determine if they were encountering something genuinely anomalous or unconsciously recreating experiences they had read about. The first 4 hours passed in methodical routine. David and his team moved through the cave with infrared cameras, documenting baseline readings and noting acoustic properties of different chambers. The cave proved to be an excellent natural amplifier. A whisper in one chamber could echo through connecting passages and emerge sounding like something entirely different. David made detailed notes about these acoustic quirks, knowing they would be essential for analyzing any recordings they captured. Around midnight, they settled into the main chamber to begin their stationary observation period. Sarah distributed headphones so each team member could monitor different audio feeds. David took the central channel, which mixed all 7 microphone sources. They sat in darkness, broken only by the dim glow of equipment displays, and they listened. The cave had its own soundscape. Water dripped from stalactites in irregular rhythms. Air currents whistled through narrow passages, creating tones that rose and fell like distant music. Somewhere deeper in the system, water flowed through an underground stream, producing a low rumble that vibrated through the rock. David cataloged each sound, identifying its source and noting its characteristics. This was the work of paranormal investigation, the tedious process of understanding every normal sound so that abnormal ones would stand out clearly. At 1:47 in the morning, Sarah held up her hand. Everyone froze. She adjusted her headphones and pointed to her equipment display. Channel 5, the microphone positioned in the far passage near what local legend called the Bell family chamber, had registered a sound spike. She played it back through the central speaker. It was a low groan, almost geological, like rock shifting under immense pressure. But Marcus checked his sensors. No seismic activity. No pressure change. No temperature fluctuation. They noted the time and continued listening. The sound came again at 2:23. This time it was louder, and it seemed to have structure to it, rising and falling in a way that suggested something more than random cave acoustics. David felt the hair on his arms rising, not from fear, but from the acute focus that came when something didn't fit expected patterns. They listened to the playback 3 times, analyzing its frequency components and comparing it to their database of natural cave sounds. It didn't match anything they had on file. 3:17 in the morning became the moment that would change David Chen's career and challenge everything he thought he understood about his work. Sarah's equipment registered activity on 3 separate channels simultaneously. The sounds were faint, almost at the threshold of detection, but when she isolated and amplified them, what emerged from the speakers made everyone in the chamber go absolutely still. It was a voice, a female voice, and it was speaking words. The phrase was difficult to parse at first because the speech pattern was unlike modern English. Sarah played it back again, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the filters to reduce background noise. The voice said something that sounded like "Thou art come to witness, as witness thee shall." The grammar was archaic, the pronunciation unlike any regional accent David had encountered in his investigations. Jennifer frantically pulled out her research notes, flipping through pages of historical accounts by lamplight. Her fingers stopped on a passage from an 1879 newspaper article. A visitor to the cave had reported hearing a voice that spoke in what he described as the manner of speech from colonial times, as if the speaker had learned English from an old Bible. The article included a phrase the witness claimed to have heard: "Thou art come seeking, and seeking thou shalt find me." Nel. The grammatical structure matched. The archaic language patterns matched. But what chilled David most was that none of his team members had read this particular article. Jennifer had compiled hundreds of pages of research, and this was one obscure account among many. There was no way the voice they had just recorded was the product of expectation or unconscious recreation. They sat in darkness, barely breathing, and continued recording. At 3:29, they heard footsteps. Not ambiguous sounds that might be interpreted as footsteps. Actual, unmistakable footsteps. Someone was walking through the passage that led to their chamber. The sounds were distinct. The scuff of feet on stone, the rhythm of a human gait moving steadily closer. Marcus checked the entrance cameras. The seal was intact. No one had entered the cave. Sarah checked her microphones, wondering if somehow they were picking up sounds from outside, though they were now hundreds of feet underground. The footsteps continued, growing louder, and David realized with a sensation like ice water in his veins that he could hear them not just through the speakers, but with his own ears. Sarah switched on her flashlight and pointed it toward the passage entrance. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that David could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. They waited, frozen, for something to emerge from the passage. Nothing appeared. After what felt like an eternity, but was actually 43 seconds according to their timestamped recordings, Sarah lowered her flashlight. Within seconds of the darkness returning, the footsteps resumed, but now they were moving away, receding back into the depths of the cave system. For the next 3 hours, until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cave entrance, the team recorded intermittent sounds that defied easy explanation. Whispers that seemed to come from multiple locations simultaneously. A sound like fabric rustling, though they were in a bare stone chamber. At one point, a breath of air moved through the chamber that carried with it a scent Jennifer described as old flowers and older earth. A smell that had no business existing in the mineral sterile environment of a limestone cave. When the property owner removed the seal at 8 in the morning, David and his team emerged looking like people who had witnessed something that fundamentally altered their understanding of reality. They had hours of audio recordings, environmental data, and detailed notes. More importantly, they had the unshakable memory of sitting in that darkness, listening to something that shouldn't exist walk steadily toward them. David spent the next 6 months analyzing the recordings. He consulted with audio forensics experts, brought in acoustic engineers, and submitted samples to laboratories that specialized in sound analysis. Every expert reached the same conclusion. The voice recording at 3:17 was genuine. It was not a product of radio interference, acoustic tricks, or audio manipulation. It was a human voice, speaking in a pattern of English that hadn't been commonly used in over 200 years, recorded in a sealed cave where no such person existed. The footsteps proved equally impossible to explain away. The rhythm and frequency patterns were consistent with bipedal human locomotion. The sounds included subtle details that would be nearly impossible to fake. The slight scrape of a heel, the different tones produced by weight shifting from one foot to another, even what sounded like the rustle of clothing accompanying the movement. In interviews conducted years after the investigation, David Chen remained cautious but candid about his conclusions. He maintained his skepticism about the paranormal industry in general, and he continued to debunk fraudulent claims and misidentified natural phenomena. But when asked about Bell Witch Cave, his response was always the same. In 15 years and over 300 investigations, this was the only location where he had captured evidence that he could not explain, could not debunk, and could not dismiss. The recordings remain in David's archive, available to researchers and skeptics alike. The voice at 3:17 in the morning continues to speak its archaic words to anyone willing to listen. And somewhere in the darkness of Bell Witch Cave, if the accounts are to be believed, something still walks the ancient passages, waiting for the next group of investigators to seal themselves inside and listen to what the darkness has to say. The fluorescent lights of Bell Caverns flickered overhead as 23 students from Millbrook Middle School shuffled through the visitor center on that crisp October morning in 2011. Thomas Ridley, 12 years old and slight for his age, lingered at the back of the group, his sneakers scuffing against the polished concrete floor. His teacher, Mrs. Patricia Hammond, would later recall that Thomas had seemed unusually quiet that day, withdrawn in a way that wasn't typical for the normally chatty boy who sat in the third row of her 7th grade history class. The field trip had been planned for months, an educational excursion meant to teach the students about geological formations and local history. Bell Caverns, with its winding passages and spectacular limestone formations, had hosted thousands of school groups over the decades. The cave system stretched for miles beneath the Pennsylvania countryside, its deepest chambers plunging more than 300 feet below the surface. What most of those students didn't know, what wasn't mentioned in the glossy brochures or the cheerful safety briefing, was the darker history that clung to those stone walls like the perpetual dampness that made everything glisten in the artificial light. The group descended into the cave system at approximately 10:30 that morning. Mrs. Hammond walked near the front with the tour guide, a college student named Derek Mills, who had been leading groups through the caverns for 2 summers. The path was well lit, marked with reflective tape, and equipped with handrails where the descent grew steep. The students chattered and pointed at formations, their voices echoing strangely in the confined spaces, bouncing off walls that had stood unchanged for millions of years. Somewhere between the 3rd and 4th viewing stations, as the group navigated a section called the Narrows, where the passage constricted to barely 4 feet wide, Thomas Ridley vanished from the group. No one saw him slip away. No one heard any cry for help or noticed when he failed to emerge from the tight passage with the rest of his classmates. It wasn't until the group reached the deep chamber, the final stop on the standard tour route, that Mrs. Hammond conducted a head count and felt her stomach drop when she came up 1 student short. What happened during those 15 minutes has become a source of intense speculation and deep unease among those who know the full story. Thomas himself has provided an account so detailed and so specific that it continues to trouble the adults who heard it, raising questions that no rational explanation has adequately answered. Thomas later told investigators that he had become disoriented in the Narrows, taking what he thought was the correct turn, only to find himself in a passage that grew progressively darker as the lights from the main path faded behind him. He called out, his voice swallowed by the stone, and received no answer. Panic began to set in as he realized he was truly alone, surrounded by absolute darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the emergency lighting that marked certain passages. He made his way forward, hand trailing along the damp wall, until he emerged into a vast chamber that he would later learn was called the Cathedral, one of the deepest accessible points in the entire cave system. The cathedral earned its name from the soaring ceiling that vanished into darkness above, beyond the reach of the sparse lighting. Massive stalagmites rose from the floor like ancient pillars, and the air hung heavy with moisture and something else. Something Thomas couldn't name, but that made the hair on his arms stand straight up. He stood there, breathing hard, trying to decide whether to go back the way he came or call out again for help. That's when he saw her. She appeared, Thomas said, from behind one of the larger formations near the far wall of the chamber. One moment the space was empty, the next she was there, as if she had simply materialized from the stone itself. She was a woman, he told the counselors later, dressed in clothing he had never seen anyone wear outside of movies about old time. But his description went far beyond a child's vague impression of historical dress. Thomas described, with unsettling precision, a morning gown in the style of the 1820s. He spoke of the high waistline that sat just below her chest, the long sleeves that extended past her wrists, the black crepe fabric that seemed to absorb what little light reached that deep chamber. He mentioned the white collar and cuffs, stark against the black dress, and the cap she wore, also white, that covered most of her hair. He noted that the dress reached the floor and seemed to puddle around her feet, which he never actually saw. When questioned by a local historian brought in to speak with him weeks later, Thomas provided details that a 12-year-old boy in 2011 should have had no knowledge of. He mentioned the dull, non-reflective quality of morning crepe, how it seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. He described the specific style of cap called a widow's coif, common in that era but hardly something featured in modern textbooks or popular culture. Most disturbing of all, he accurately described the tradition of covering buttons and jewelry with black fabric or enamel during periods of deep mourning, noting that the woman wore no visible ornaments, and that even the buttons on her dress seemed to be wrapped in the same matte black material. But the clothing was not the most chilling aspect of Thomas's account. It was his description of the woman herself that matched, in horrifying detail, the alleged appearance of the Bell Witch as documented in historical records from the early 1800s. Thomas spoke of a woman of indeterminate age, her face pale to the point of appearing almost gray in the dim light. He described thin lips pressed into a straight line, neither smiling nor frowning, and eyes that he could not quite focus on, as if they refused to be clearly seen. He mentioned her hands, which were folded at her waist, fingers long and white, and perfectly still. Most unsettling was his description of her posture, the absolute stillness with which she stood, not swaying or shifting weight, as living people unconsciously do, but standing as motionless as the stone formations surrounding her. The woman spoke to him, Thomas said, though he couldn't say for certain that her lips moved. Her voice, he reported, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely in the vast chamber. The words she spoke had been seared into his memory, repeated verbatim in every interview, every counseling session, every nightmare that followed. She told him that she had been watching, that she always watched the children who came into her cave, that she had been there for longer than anyone remembered, long before the electric lights and the guided tours, long before the caverns had a name or the paths were marked for safety. She told him that she knew every child who entered, saw them all in the darkness, heard their laughter echoing through passages that had once known only silence and her own footsteps. She said she was particularly interested in the children who wandered off alone, who strayed from the safety of the group, who found themselves in the deep places where the modern world had not yet fully penetrated. Thomas asked her, with the desperate politeness of a frightened child, if she could help him find his way back to his class. She did not answer this question directly. Instead, she told him that he was standing in her favorite place in all the winding miles of cave, that she came to this chamber often to think and to wait. She said that she had been waiting for a very long time, though she did not specify what she was waiting for. Then she told him that he should go, that his teacher was looking for him, and that he should follow the wall to his left until he found the lights again. She pointed toward one of the darker passages leading out of the cathedral, her arm extending with that same unnatural stillness, and Thomas, not daring to disobey, began walking in the direction she indicated. He looked back once, he said, and she was still standing there, arm outstretched, watching him with those eyes he could never quite see clearly. When he looked back a second time, barely 10 steps later, she was gone. Mrs. Hammond and Derek Mills found Thomas approximately 15 minutes after they had realized he was missing. They discovered him standing at the entrance to the cathedral chamber, facing inward, completely motionless. Mrs. Hammond called his name 3 times before he responded, and when he finally turned to look at her, she said later that his face was bone white, his eyes wide and unfocused, his entire body trembling despite the constant 54-degree temperature of the cave. Thomas could not speak. He did not respond to questions, did not seem to recognize his teacher or register the presence of the tour guide. He stood rigid as Mrs. Hammond placed her hands on his shoulders, his breathing shallow and rapid, his gaze fixed on something in the middle distance that only he could see. Derek Mills radioed for additional help, and 2 more staff members arrived within minutes, but Thomas remained unresponsive, locked in what the emergency medical technicians who eventually examined him called a dissociative state. They guided him back through the passages toward the surface, Mrs. Hammond keeping one hand on his shoulder the entire time, speaking softly to him, though he gave no sign of hearing her words. The other students, corralled in the visitor center above, fell silent when they saw Thomas emerge, his face still blank, his movements mechanical as the adults led him to a bench and wrapped him in an emergency blanket despite the mild October weather. It took nearly 40 minutes before Thomas began to respond to external stimuli. He started to cry, not the loud sobbing of a child's normal distress, but quiet tears that ran down his face while the rest of his body remained rigid and still. Mrs. Hammond stayed with him, and slowly, very slowly, he began to speak, answering simple questions about his name and the day of the week before the story of what he had seen began to pour out in a torrent of words and tears. The psychological aftermath of those 15 minutes in the cathedral chamber has been severe and lasting. Thomas's parents, initially skeptical of his account, became increasingly alarmed as their son's behavior deteriorated in the weeks following the incident. The night terrors began almost immediately, violent episodes during which Thomas would wake screaming about women in black standing at the foot of his bed, about being trapped in the dark with voices echoing all around him, about hands reaching out from the stone to pull him back down into the depth. His refusal to enter dark spaces became absolute and debilitating. He could not sleep without multiple lights on in his room. He could not enter a movie theater or a windowless classroom. Even walking through a shadowed hallway or stepping into a garage would trigger panic attacks so severe that he would hyperventilate and sometimes vomit. His parents installed additional lighting throughout their home, kept nightlights burning in every room, and eventually sought professional help when it became clear that Thomas's fear was not diminishing with time. The counseling began 6 weeks after the incident and continued for more than 3 years. Thomas saw a succession of therapists, each attempting to help him process the trauma of his experience. Some approached it as a straightforward case of a child becoming lost and frightened in an unfamiliar environment, his mind creating the woman as a manifestation of his fear. Others were less certain, troubled by the specificity of his account and the genuine terror that gripped him whenever he was asked to recount the details. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, the child psychologist who worked with Thomas most extensively, noted in her records that his account never wavered, never changed in any significant detail despite being recounted dozens of times over the course of his treatment. This consistency, she wrote, was unusual for a child's imagined or confabulated memory, which typically shifts and evolves with repeated telling. Thomas's story remained fixed, as if he were describing something he had actually witnessed rather than something his frightened mind had invented. The historical accuracy of his descriptions troubled Dr. Chen particularly. She consulted with historians and costume experts, showing them Thomas's drawings of the woman's clothing and relaying his verbal description. The consensus was that his account matched morning dress customs from the early 19th century with remarkable precision, far beyond what a 7th grader in 2011 would typically know. When she asked Thomas where he had learned about such clothing, he insisted he had never seen anything like it before that day in the cave. Most disturbing to Dr. Chen was Thomas's account of the woman's words about watching children in the cave. This detail, she noted, had emerged only gradually during their sessions, as if Thomas had been reluctant to share it, and it carried a predatory undertone that she found deeply unsettling. Whether the words came from an actual entity or from some dark corner of Thomas's own psyche, they spoke to a fear that went beyond the simple terror of being lost in the dark. Years later, Thomas Ridley continues to struggle with the aftermath of those 15 minutes in the cathedral chamber. He is now an adult, but the night terrors persist, though less frequently than in the years immediately following the incident. He still cannot comfortably enter completely dark spaces, though he has developed coping mechanisms that allow him to function in most normal situations. He refuses to discuss the incident publicly and declined to be interviewed for this account. Mrs. Hammond left teaching 2 years after the incident, citing the stress of that day as a contributing factor to her decision. She has said that the image of Thomas standing catatonic at the entrance to that chamber, his face drained of all color, his eyes seeing something she could not, remains one of the most disturbing sights of her 30-year career in education. Bell Caverns continues to operate as a tourist attraction, hosting thousands of visitors each year. The cathedral chamber remains on the tour route, though guides now maintain stricter supervision of groups, particularly school children, when passing through the sections where Thomas became separated. The story of his encounter has circulated among staff members, though it is never mentioned to visitors. Some guides report feeling uneasy in the cathedral chamber, a sense of being watched that they attribute to knowing Thomas's story, rather than experiencing anything genuinely unusual. But on quiet days, when the tours are sparse and the caverns fall as silent as they were centuries ago, some staff members admit to wondering what might still linger in those deep places, watching and waiting in the darkness beyond the reach of the electric lights. Raymond Foster had been a caretaker for over 20 years, working security and maintenance at various properties throughout Robertson County, Tennessee. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. When he accepted the position as night caretaker for the Bell Witch Cave property in early 2018, his primary concerns were practical ones: keeping vandals away, ensuring the buildings remained secure, making sure the property stayed safe for the next day's tourists. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Adams knew about the Bell Witch, about the cave's dark reputation, about the accounts from visitors and employees over the years. But Raymond had spent his career in empty buildings after dark, and he had never encountered anything he couldn't explain with logic and a steady hand. That confidence would be shattered completely during one February night, his last shift at the cave, an experience so terrifying that he walked away from the job immediately and refused to ever return to the property, even in broad daylight. The evening started normally enough. Raymond arrived just before sunset, as he always did, parking his truck near the main office building. His German shepherd, Duke, rode with him on every shift, a loyal companion who had accompanied him to countless job sites over the past 8 years. Duke was a trained security dog, calm and obedient, unfazed by strange noises or wildlife. Raymond trusted the dog's instincts implicitly. They had a routine: walk the perimeter, check all the buildings, settle into the office for the night with periodic rounds every few hours. In all the weeks Raymond had worked at the cave property, there had been minor oddities, small things he had dismissed. Tools moved from where he left them. Cold spots that seemed to drift through rooms. The occasional creak or groan of old wood that sounded almost like footsteps. Nothing that particularly bothered him. Nothing he couldn't rationalize. But this night felt different from the moment they arrived. Duke refused to leave the truck. The dog sat in the passenger seat, whining softly, his ears flat against his head. Raymond coaxed him, commanded him, finally had to physically lift the 70-pound animal out of the vehicle. The moment Duke's paws touched the ground, he pulled toward the truck, straining against his leash, something Raymond had never seen him do. The dog's eyes were fixed on the tree line near the cave entrance, and a low growl rumbled continuously in his chest. Raymond felt the first prickle of unease then, but he pushed it down. Animals had off days. Maybe Duke had picked up the scent of a coyote or a bear. They made it to the office, but Duke refused to settle. He paced the small space, alternating between the window and the door, that same low growl never quite stopping. Raymond tried to focus on his usual tasks, checking the logbook, reviewing the next day's tour schedule, but he found his attention drawn again and again to the dog's agitation. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, the first door slammed. The sound came from somewhere in the building, a sharp crack of wood against frame that made Raymond jump. He grabbed his flashlight and walked through the office space, checking each room. Every door was as he had left it. He returned to the main room, settling back into his chair, telling himself it was just the wind, though the night outside was perfectly still. 20 minutes later, another door slammed, this one louder, closer. Duke barked, a sharp alarm bark that the well-trained dog rarely used. Raymond moved through the building again, faster this time, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. All doors remained in their positions. He checked the windows, thinking perhaps someone was outside, trying to disturb him. But the property was empty, the parking area visible and vacant in the moonlight. When he returned to the office, he found his keys on the floor, though he was certain he had left them on the desk. He picked them up, his hand not quite steady, and clipped them to his belt loop. The phenomena escalated. Over the next hour, doors slammed throughout the building in a sequence that seemed to move, to progress from the rooms farthest from the cave entrance toward those closest to it. Each slam was followed by a period of oppressive silence. Then the next would crack through the air, closer than before. Duke had stopped growling. Instead, the dog pressed himself against Raymond's legs, shaking, his tail tucked tight. Raymond had never seen the animal truly frightened before. He considered calling his supervisor, considered leaving entirely, but professional pride held him in place. He had never abandoned a post. He was not about to let local legends and his own imagination drive him away from a job. Then the lights began to fail. The office had emergency lighting, battery-powered fixtures that were supposed to remain operational, even if the main power cut out. At 9:45 in the evening, the emergency light farthest from the cave entrance flickered and died. Raymond checked the fixture, but there was no obvious reason for the failure. The batteries had been replaced recently. 5 minutes later, the next light in the sequence went dark. Then, the next. Raymond watched with growing dread as the lights died one by one, creating a progression of darkness that moved inexorably toward the cave entrance. The pattern was too deliberate to be coincidence, too sequential to be random electrical failure. By 10:15, only 2 emergency lights remained operational, both in the room where Raymond stood with Duke. The dog was trembling so violently that Raymond could feel it through his pant leg. The building had fallen into a silence so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. No creaks, no settling sounds, no distant traffic noise from the road. Just silence, heavy and waiting. Raymond made a decision then. He would walk the perimeter one more time, confirm the property was secure, and then he would call his supervisor and request backup or permission to leave early. He was not a coward, but he was also not a fool, and every instinct in his body was screaming that something was wrong. He never made it to the perimeter. As he moved toward the office door, Duke planted his feet and refused to follow. The dog, who had never disobeyed a direct command in his life, sat down and would not budge. Raymond pulled the leash, commanded, finally gave up and tied it to a desk leg. He would make the rounds quickly and return for the animal. He stepped outside into the February cold, his flashlight beam cutting a white path through the darkness. That was when he heard it. A sound coming from inside the cave itself. A cry, high and desperate, almost like a child in distress. It came again, echoing from the cave mouth, a wail of such apparent anguish that Raymond's professional instincts overrode his fear. Someone was in the cave. Someone was hurt. He moved toward the cave entrance, calling out, identifying himself as security. The crying continued, seeming to come from deep within the limestone passages. Raymond reached the entrance, the black mouth of the cave yawning before him. Every rational part of his mind told him to wait, to call for help, to not enter alone. But the crying sounded so real, so genuinely distressed, and he could not live with himself if someone was injured and he had done nothing. He stepped into the cave. His flashlight beam revealed the familiar stone walls, the downward sloping passage, the formations he had seen dozens of times during day visits. He called out again, his voice swallowed by the limestone. The crying had stopped. In its place came a silence even deeper than what he had experienced in the office, a silence that seemed alive, aware, waiting. He was perhaps 30 feet into the cave when he saw it. The beam of his flashlight caught movement ahead, and he turned the light fully onto the passage before him. A figure stood in the tunnel. Not a shadow, not a trick of light, but a solid, 3-dimensional human form. It was tall, taller than any person Raymond had ever seen, its head nearly touching the cave ceiling. The figure was dressed in what appeared to be dark, old-fashioned clothing, though the details seemed to shift and blur when he tried to focus on them. But it was the face that stopped Raymond's breath in his chest. Where features should have been, there was instead a darkness deeper than the surrounding cave, a void that seemed to pull at his vision. and it was looking directly at him. For a frozen moment, neither moved. Raymond's mind struggled to process what he was seeing, cycling through explanations, rejecting each one. Then the figure began to move toward him. Not walking, not quite floating, but gliding forward with horrible, deliberate intent. The temperature in the cave plummeted so suddenly that Raymond could see his breath misting in the flashlight beam. The malevolence radiating from the figure was palpable, a psychic weight that pressed against him like a physical force. He felt, with absolute certainty, that the thing moving toward him meant him harm. Not merely to frighten, but to injure, to damage, perhaps to kill. Raymond ran, ducked away. He turned and bolted back toward the cave entrance, his flashlight beam jerking wildly across the stone walls. Behind him, he could hear something following, could feel the presence closing the distance. His foot caught on an uneven section of floor, and he stumbled, going down hard on one knee. The flashlight flew from his hand, clattering against stone, its beams spinning to illuminate the passage behind him. The figure was there, impossibly close, reaching toward him with arms that seemed too long, fingers that extended into points. Raymond screamed, a sound of pure animal terror, and scrambled forward on his hands and knees. His keys tore from his belt loop, left behind in his frantic crawl toward the entrance. He could feel cold air on the back of his neck, could sense something directly behind him, almost touching him. He burst from the cave entrance into the night air and kept running. Across the property, past the office where Duke was barking frantically, to his truck. His hands shook so badly he could barely get the door open. He threw himself into the driver's seat and started the engine, gravel spraying as he accelerated toward the exit. Only when he was on the main road a mile from the property did he pull over, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and terror. His phone was ringing. His supervisor, wondering why the security cameras had gone dark. Raymond couldn't answer. He sat in the truck, trying to breathe, trying to slow his racing heart. It was only later, when he finally made it home, that he discovered the scratches. 3 long marks down his back, starting at his shoulder blades and extending to his lower back. They had torn through his shirt and drawn blood. 4 parallel lines that looked like they had been made by something with fingers or claws. They burned like fire. His wife saw them and went pale. Raymond had no explanation for them. He had felt nothing in the cave, no impact, no pain. But the marks were there, undeniable, physical evidence of contact with something. In interviews months later, Raymond's voice still trembles when he describes that night. He is a man who has rebuilt his sense of security, but you can see the shadow of that terror still in his eyes. He describes the malevolence he felt emanating from the figure in the cave, the sense of active hostility that went beyond mere haunting. This was not a residual presence, not an echo of past events. This was something aware, something that had responded to his presence, something that had chased him with what he describes as murderous intent. The property manager found Raymond's keys the next day, inside the cave, exactly where he said he had lost them. His equipment, left behind in the office, was recovered. Duke had torn the leash free and was found the next morning, waiting by Raymond's truck, still trembling. The emergency lights all functioned normally when tested, their failures apparently temporary. The scratches on Raymond's back took weeks to heal and left scars. Raymond Foster never returned to the Bell Witch Cave. He never collected his final paycheck in person, having it mailed instead. He refuses to discuss the details with most people, and only agreed to limited interviews after much persuasion. When he does speak about it, he is adamant on one point. Something dangerous lives in that cave. Something that is not human, and has not been human for a very long time, if ever. Something that does not want people there. Something capable of harm. His testimony stands as the most compelling modern evidence that whatever haunts the Bell Witch Cave has not faded with time, has not grown weaker, has not become a mere echo of past horrors. If anything, according to Raymond, it has grown stronger, bolder, more actively malevolent. His story is the one that silences skeptics, the account that even hardened paranormal investigators approach with caution and respect. Because Raymond Foster was not seeking attention, was not prone to fantasy, and had absolutely nothing to gain by fabricating his experience. He was simply a man doing his job who encountered something that shattered his understanding of reality, and left physical marks he carries to this day. The cave waits, just as it has for 2 centuries, just as it will tomorrow when the next tour group descends into its depths, phones in hand, laughter echoing off limestone walls that may hold more than just geological history. You can visit the Bell Witch Cave today, right now if you wanted to. It sits on private property in Robertson County, Tennessee, open to anyone willing to pay the admission fee and walk down into that cool darkness. Thousands do every year. They come with their curiosity and their skepticism, their cameras ready to capture something, anything that might explain what 6 credible witnesses encountered across decades of time. But here is what we must acknowledge, standing at the end of this investigation. Despite testimony from a school teacher in 1917, a teenager in 1968, and a military veteran in 2009. Despite evidence from an experienced paranormal investigator, a documentary crew, and a trained psychologist. Despite their consistency, their credibility, their unchanged stories told across spans of years and miles, we have no explanation for what happened in that cave. None that satisfy, none that resolve, none that let us close this case and walk away certain. The rational explanations crumble under examination. Collective hallucination cannot account for solitary experiences separated by decades. Geological phenomena cannot explain invisible hands and intelligent responses. Suggestion and expectation cannot create the same specific encounter for witnesses who knew nothing of previous reports. We are left with testimony that remains stubbornly unexplained, pointing toward something present in that cave that defies our comfortable categories of reality. So the questions linger, heavier now than when we began. Is Kate Batts truly still bound to this place, her curse echoing through centuries? A woman so wronged, so consumed by anger that death itself could not release her? The legend says she swore she would haunt the Bell family forever, but families end, generations scatter. Perhaps the cave became her anchor when the people she sought were gone. Perhaps limestone and darkness became her prison and her kingdom both. Or does the answer lie not in ghosts but in the stone itself? Scientists have theorized that certain materials, particularly quartz-bearing rock, might somehow record traumatic energy. The limestone of this cave, formed over millions of years, compressed and crystallized. Could it hold imprints of anguish, rage, terror? Might we be encountering not a spirit, but a recording, endlessly playing back the emotional residue of events long past? It would explain the repetition, the same encounters experienced by different people. But it would not explain the intelligence witnesses report, the sense of interaction, of being seen and known. And then there is the darker possibility that something else entirely has claimed this space, something that wears the Bell Witch legend like a mask because we gave it that shape with our belief. Something that responds to our expectations, that feeds on our fear, that has learned to play the role we assigned it. This thought is perhaps most unsettling of all, because it suggests that our stories themselves have power, that our collective belief can give form to the formless. The encounters continue. This is not ancient history we are discussing, not folklore safely distant in time. The cave remains open, and the reports persist. Tour guides speak carefully about what they have felt in certain passages. Visitors post online about experiences that left them shaken. The pattern holds, year after year, the same cold spots, the same sense of presence, the same feeling of being followed from deeper in the cave. And so we arrive at this haunting realization. The next witness could be anyone, could be you. The cave does not discriminate, does not choose only the sensitive or the seeking. It waits for whoever descends into that particular darkness, whoever rounds that corner where the natural light fades completely, whoever stands in that chamber where 6 credible people encountered something that should not exist. What will they see? What will you see if you go? Will you feel that sudden cold that has nothing to do with underground temperatures? Will you sense eyes upon you from passages that hold only darkness? Will you hear your name, whispered by a voice that cannot be there? Or will you walk through and emerge unchanged, wondering what all the fuss was about? While behind you in the dark, something watches and waits for the next visitor, the next potential witness. The question remains unanswered. The cave keeps its secrets. And somewhere in that limestone darkness, in passages carved by water and time, something persists. Whether it is Kate Batts, forever bound by her own curse. Whether it is stone that remembers what stone should not remember. Whether it is something else entirely, something we have not yet found words to describe. It is there. The witnesses tell us so. Their credibility tells us so. The consistency across decades tells us so. We are left standing at the boundary between what we know and what we cannot explain. The Bell Witch Cave remains, open and waiting, holding its mysteries close. And the only way to truly know what lurks in that darkness is to descend into it yourself, understanding that you may emerge with your own unexplainable encounter, your own testimony that will sound impossible even to your own ears. The cave has been waiting for 200 years. It can wait a little longer. The question is, are you willing to find out what it has been waiting for? That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.